Welcome to the shadowy depths of the forest, where darkness reigns and secrets lurk behind every twisted tree. I'm your guide into the unknown, ready to lead you through tales that will chill you to the bone. But before we venture deeper, tell me, what city are you watching from? Leave a comment below and let me know where the fear is spreading tonight. If you dare to join our community of brave souls, hit that subscribe button now. And don't forget to leave a like if you want more terrifying tales from the deep woods. Now let me take you to a place where the branches reach out like gnarled fingers, and the wind whispers warnings through decaying leaves. Our story begins on a moonless night, when a group of friends decided to test their courage by camping in the heart of these cursed woods. Little did they know, something ancient and hungry was waiting for them. The gentle lapping of water against the shore had always been a soothing sound to me, but today it felt different, ominous, as if each wave carried a whispered warning I couldn't quite decipher. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing instead on the task at hand, threading a wriggling worm onto my hook. Just another day of fishing, I muttered to myself, attempting to calm my inexplicably frayed nerves. Get it together, John. The sun was sinking low on the horizon, painting Lake Tahoe in a palette of reds and golds that should have been beautiful. Instead, the fiery hues reminded me of fresh blood spilled across the water's surface. I blinked hard, trying to dispel the macabre image from my mind. With a practiced flick of my wrist, I cast my line out into the lake. The lure sailed through the air, breaking the mirrored surface with a soft plop that sent ripples spreading outward. As I settled in to wait, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier than usual, pressing down on me with an almost tangible weight. The typically bustling shoreline was deserted, save for a few scattered pieces of litter that skittered along the sand in a light breeze. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned the area, their absence leaving an eerie silence in their wake. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Anyone out there?" No response came, not even an echo. My words seemed to be swallowed up by the oppressive atmosphere. A shiver ran down my spine, and I found myself wishing I'd invited a friend along on this trip. As the minutes ticked by, my unease grew. The fish weren't biting, which wasn't unusual in itself, but combined with everything else, it felt like yet another warning sign I was choosing to ignore. I leaned forward, squinting at my bobber floating lazily on the water's surface. "Come on, you little bastards," I whispered. "Just one bite and we can call it a day." That's when I saw it, a flicker of movement beneath the water just beyond where my lure sat. Excitement momentarily overrode my anxiety. I leaned closer, peering into the depths. "That's it," I coaxed. "Come to Papa." But as I stared into the lake, trying to make out the shape of what I hoped was a fat trout, something else caught my eye. My own reflection, distorted by the gentle waves, seemed wrong. I blinked, sure I was seeing things, but the image remained. My reflected face wore an expression I couldn't recall making, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched from ear to ear. Its eyes gleamed with a malevolent light that sent ice through my veins. As I watched, frozen in horror, the reflection's mouth began to move. "John," it mouthed silently. "Join us, John." I scrambled backward, nearly toppling over in my haste to put distance between myself and the water's edge. My heart hammered in my chest, and I could hear blood rushing in my ears. "This isn't real," I said aloud, my voice shaking. "I'm imagining things. Too much sun, not enough water. That's all this is." But even as I spoke, trying to rationalize what I'd seen, I knew deep down that this was something beyond logical explanation. Against my better judgment, I inched forward again, drawn by a morbid curiosity I couldn't suppress. The reflection was still there, waiting. As our eyes met, I felt a pull, not physical, but something deeper, as if hooks had latched onto my very soul. The water's surface began to ripple and churn, and to my horror, I saw a hand emerging from the depths. It was my hand, but not. The fingers were longer, the nails sharp and claw-like. It reached for me, breaking the surface tension of the water with a sound like tearing flesh. "No," I gasped, trying to back away, but I couldn't move. My body refused to obey, held in place by some unseen force. More hands followed the first, grasping at the air, at my clothes, at my skin. Cold, wet fingers brushed against my ankle, and I let out a strangled cry. "Help!" I screamed, finally finding my voice. "Somebody help me!" But there was no one to hear my cries. The hands were pulling now, dragging me inch by inexorable inch towards the water's edge. I clawed at the ground, fingernails breaking as I scrabbled for purchase on the rocky shore. "Please," I whimpered, tears streaming down my face. "Please, no." As my feet touched the icy water, I heard my reflection speak again. This time the words didn't just come from the lake. They seemed to emanate from every reflective surface around me, a chorus of my own voice twisted into something inhuman and hungry. "Welcome home, John," it said. "We've been waiting for you." With a final violent yank, I was pulled beneath the surface. The last thing I saw before the dark waters closed over my head was my own face, grinning down at me from above, finally free of the watery prison that had held it for so long. As I sank into the cold, lightless depths, a terrifying thought occurred to me. How long had my reflection been waiting for this moment? And how many other unsuspecting souls had it lured to their doom before setting its sights on me? The lake swallowed my silent scream, leaving nothing but ripples on the surface to mark where I had once been. My lungs burned as I clawed my way back to the surface, breaking through with a desperate gasp. I dragged myself onto the shore, coughing and sputtering, my clothes clinging to my body like a second skin. As I lay there, trembling and gasping for air, I became aware of a fundamental wrongness in my surroundings. What happened?" I croaked, my voice raw from swallowing lake water. Slowly, I pushed myself up to a sitting position, and that's when the full horror of my situation hit me. The world around me was familiar, yet terribly, unmistakably altered. The trees that had stood tall and green just moments ago were now twisted, grotesque parodies of themselves. Their bark was black and peeling, branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled, arthritic fingers. I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaky beneath me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the eerie stillness. "Is anyone there?" No answer came. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. I turned in a slow circle, taking in my transformed surroundings. The sky above was no longer the warm hues of sunset, but a sickly, pulsating green that hurt my eyes to look at directly. "This can't be real," I muttered, running a hand through my wet hair. I must have hit my head. Yeah, that's it. I'm unconscious, and this is all some crazy dream. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. The chill of my wet clothes, the sting of the cuts on my hands from clawing at the rocky shore, it all felt too vivid, too present to be a dream. A movement in the corner of my eye caught my attention. I spun around, heart pounding, to face the lake. The water was different here too, thick and dark, more like oil than water. And there, just beneath the surface, I saw a face. My face. But it wasn't my reflection. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, the face rose from the water, followed by a body. My body. My doppelganger stood there, knee-deep in the oily liquid, staring at me with eyes that gleamed with malevolent intelligence. "Welcome," it said, its voice a perfect mimicry of my own, yet somehow wrong, hollow and echoing. "We've been expecting you, John." I took an involuntary step backward. "What are you?" I demanded, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Where am I?" The thing wearing my face smiled, a cruel twist of lips that I hoped never to see in a mirror. "I'm you, of course," it replied. "The better you, the stronger you. As for where you are, It spread its arms wide, encompassing the nightmarish landscape around us. "This is home. Your new home." "No." I shook my head vehemently. "This isn't real. I don't belong here. I need to get back to my world." My doppelganger laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Your world? Oh, John, this has always been your world. You just didn't know it yet." It began to walk towards me, each step sending ripples across the surface of the dark lake. I wanted to run, to flee from this twisted version of myself, but my feet seemed rooted to the spot. "You see," it continued, now only a few feet away, "we've all been waiting for our chance, watching from the other side, biding our time. And you, my friend, you were kind enough to open the door." "I didn't open anything," I protested weakly. "I was just fishing, I didn't mean to." "Intent is irrelevant." My double cut me off. "The threshold has been crossed. The way is open, and now, well," its grin widened, showing too many teeth. "Now the fun begins." A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach as the implications of its words sank in. "What do you mean? We've all been waiting. Are there more of you?" The doppelganger's eyes glittered with dark amusement. "Oh yes, John. So many more. Every reflection, every mirrored surface in your world. We've been there, watching, waiting. And now, thanks to you, we're coming through." I felt the blood drain from my face. "No," I whispered. "I won't let you. I'll find a way to stop this, to close whatever door I opened." My double threw its head back and laughed, a sound that seemed to shake the very air around us. "Stop us? Oh, John, you can't even stop me." It took another step closer, and I could see now that its skin had a translucent quality, as if it wasn't quite solid. "But please, do try. It'll make things so much more interesting." With a burst of adrenaline, I finally managed to break free from my paralysis. I turned and ran, feet pounding against the dead earth, breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I could hear my doppelganger's laughter, growing fainter as I put distance between us. But as I ran, dodging between twisted trees and leaping over bubbling, noxious streams, a horrible realization began to dawn on me. No matter how far or fast I ran, I couldn't escape. This nightmarish world stretched out in all directions, a dark mirror of the place I called home. And somewhere out there, beyond the veil I had unwittingly torn, my world was waiting. A world now under threat from the horrors I had unleashed. As the sickly green sky pulsed overhead and the air grew thicker with each labored breath, I knew that I had to find a way back. Not just to save myself, but to save everyone I had left behind. The game was on, and the stakes were higher than I could have ever imagined. In this twisted reflection of reality, I was both the hunter and the hunted. And somewhere out there, wearing my face and my life, my double was preparing to step through into my world. The true nightmare, I realized with a shudder, was only just beginning. As night descended upon Lake Tahoe, an oppressive darkness seemed to swallow everything whole. I stumbled through the woods, my clothes still damp and clinging uncomfortably to my skin. Every shadow felt alive, every rustle in the underbrush a potential threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that my eyes, were watching my every move. "Get it together, John," I muttered to myself, trying to calm my frayed nerves. "There has to be a way out of this nightmare." I fumbled for my phone, desperate for some connection to normality. The screen flickered to life, casting an eerie blue glow over my surroundings. For a split second, I felt relief wash over me. Then I saw it. My reflection in the darkened screen, grinning back at me with that same malevolent smile. "No," I cried, dropping the phone as if it had burned me. It clattered to the ground, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. Hesitantly, I bent to retrieve it. The reflection was gone, but now I couldn't trust even this small piece of technology. Was anything safe? I pushed on, making my way back towards the small town near the lake. Street lamps buzzed to life as I approached, their light a sickly yellow that did little to dispel the darkness. As I passed by storefront windows, I kept my eyes resolutely forward, afraid of what I might see if I allowed my gaze to wander. A figure stepped out of the shadows ahead, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Whoa there, son," came a gruff voice. "You look like you've seen a ghost." An old man stood before me, concern etched on his weathered face. He was the first real person I'd encountered since my terrifying experience at the lake, and I felt a desperate need to confide in someone. Anyone. I'm not sure what I've seen," I stammered. "Something's wrong with the lake. With the reflections. They're alive." The old man's expression shifted, concern giving way to something darker. "So, you've seen it too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart leaped into my throat. "What do you mean? You know about this?" He glanced around nervously, then gestured for me to follow him. "Not here. It's not safe to talk in the open." Against my better judgment, I followed him to a small, run-down cabin on the outskirts of town. Once inside, he bolted the door and drew the curtains. "The name's Frank," he said, settling into a worn armchair. "And I've been waiting a long time for someone else to see what I've seen." Over the next hour, Frank spun a tale that would have seemed insane if I hadn't experienced it myself. He spoke of an ancient threshold between our world and another, a place where reality was thin and malleable. "The lake is the center of it all," Frank explained, his eyes gleaming in the dim light of the cabin. "It's a portal, you see, a gateway between here and somewhere else." "But why?" I asked, my mind reeling. "Why is this happening?" Frank leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Legend has it that long ago, powerful beings from the other side tried to invade our world. They were beaten back, trapped on the other side of the threshold, but they never stopped trying to break through." A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the words of my doppelganger. "And now they're coming through? Because of me?" Frank shook his head. "Don't blame yourself, son. The threshold has been weakening for years. You just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." As if to punctuate his words, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows. We both jumped, eyeing the curtains warily. "So what do we do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "How do we stop this?" Frank's expression grew grim. "I've been researching this for years, trying to find a way to seal the threshold for good. There might be a way, but it's dangerous. And it requires going back to the lake." The very thought of returning to that place filled me with dread. But what choice did I have? "Tell me what we need to do," I said, steeling myself for whatever was to come. Frank nodded, a look of relief passing over his face. "First, we need to gather some supplies. Ancient texts speak of a ritual that can close the portal, but it requires specific items." As Frank listed off the necessary components, rare herbs, crystals, and a book of forgotten lore, I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could fix this. Maybe I could undo the damage I'd unwittingly caused. But even as we made our plans, a nagging doubt gnawed at the back of my mind. What if we were already too late? What if the invasion had already begun? As if in answer to my unspoken fears, a sharp crack echoed through the night. We both turned to see a spiderweb of cracks spreading across the cabin's only mirror. "They know," Frank whispered, his face pale in the dim light. "They know we're on to them." The mirror shattered, shards of glass exploding outward, and in each glittering piece I saw a face, my face, staring back with undisguised malice. "We need to move," I said, grabbing Frank's arm. "Now!" As we fled into the night, the sound of breaking glass following us, I realized that our discovery of the threshold was just the beginning. The real battle was yet to come, and the fate of two worlds hung in the balance. The race against our reflections had begun, and I prayed we would be fast enough to save not just ourselves, but everyone we'd left behind in a world now teetering on the brink of invasion. Frank and I spent the next few days gathering the supplies needed for the ritual, all while trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. But as we worked, The signs of impending doom became impossible to ignore. It started small, whispered conversations overheard in the grocery store, strange glances from passers-by, an overall sense of unease that seemed to blanket the entire town. On the third day, as we were leaving the local New Age shop with the last of our crystals, a woman came running down the street, her face pale with terror. "Help!" she screamed. "Somebody help me! My husband, he's not himself!" I exchanged a worried glance with Frank before approaching her. "Ma'am, what's wrong? What happened to your husband?" She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "He came home from work and he was different. His eyes, they were wrong. And when I asked him what was going on, he just smiled at me. It wasn't his smile. It was cruel." I finished for her, my blood running cold, like it didn't quite fit his face. The woman nodded frantically. "Yes, how did you know?" Before I could answer, a man rounded the corner. He looked ordinary enough, middle-aged, slightly overweight, wearing a rumpled business suit. But his eyes, they gleamed with that same malevolent light I'd seen in my own reflection. "Darling," he called out, his voice a perfect mimicry of concern. "There you are. I've been so worried." The woman shrank back, pressing herself against me. "That's not my husband," she whimpered. The man's face twisted into that now familiar cruel smile. Now, dear. Don't make a scene. It's time to come home." Frank stepped forward, putting himself between us and the imposter. "I think the lady said she doesn't want to go with you, friend." The thing wearing the husband's face turned its gaze on Frank, and I saw a flicker of recognition in its eyes. Ah, the old man who knows too much, and his new friend, the one who opened the door. How convenient to find you both here. It took a step towards us, and the air around it seemed to ripple and distort. "You can't stop what's coming. We're already here, spreading through your world like a virus. Soon we'll outnumber you. And then..." Its grin widened impossibly, stretching beyond the confines of human anatomy. "Then the real fun begins." "Run!" Frank shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me away. We fled down the street, the woman in tow, the sound of inhuman laughter echoing behind us. As we ran, I noticed other people on the street stopping to stare. Some looked confused and frightened. Others wore that same cruel smile. The invasion wasn't just beginning. It was well underway. We ducked into an alley, gasping for breath. The woman was sobbing quietly, and Frank looked grim. "It's happening faster than I thought," he said, his voice low. "We need to perform the ritual tonight, or it might be too late." I nodded, trying to ignore the panic clawing at my chest. "What about her?" I asked, gesturing to the woman. Frank sighed. "We can't save everyone, but if we seal the threshold, we might be able to stop more of them from coming through." The woman looked up, her eyes wild with fear. "What are you talking about? What's happening?" I knelt beside her, trying to keep my voice calm. "Something bad has come into our world. We're going to try to stop it, but it's dangerous. Is there somewhere safe you can go? Family out of town, maybe?" She nodded slowly. "My sister. She lives a few hours away." "Good," I said, helping her to her feet. "Go there. Don't trust anyone, not even people you think you know. And whatever you do, stay away from mirrors and other reflective surfaces." As she hurried away, I turned back to Frank. "So, what's our plan?" He pulled out a crumpled map of the area. "We need to get back to the lake. The ritual has to be performed at the point where the threshold is thinnest, where you first saw your reflection acting strangely." As night fell, we made our way through the woods towards Lake Tahoe. The forest seemed alive with whispers and movement, shadows flitting just at the edge of our vision. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. We emerged from the tree line, and I felt my heart sink. The shore was crowded with people, or things that looked like people. They stood motionless, staring out at the water, their faces reflected in the glassy surface of the lake. "Oh God," I whispered. "There's so many of them." Frank gripped my shoulder. "Stay focused. We have one shot at this. We need to get to the water's edge without them noticing us." As we crept forward, I noticed more details that sent chills down my spine. The people weren't breathing. Their eyes, when I could see them, had that same hollow, hungry look. And in the lake, their reflections moved independently, reaching out as if trying to crawl from the water. We were halfway to the shore when one of them turned, its gaze locking onto us. It opened its mouth in a silent scream, and as one, the entire crowd began to move. "Run!" Frank yelled, all pretense of stealth abandoned. We sprinted towards the water, the horde of not-quite people closing in behind us. I could hear their footsteps, a thunderous drumbeat of pursuit, the air filled with a high-pitched keening, a sound no human throat could make. As we reached the water's edge, I risked a glance back. The sight nearly stopped my heart. It wasn't just people chasing us anymore. The invaders had shed their human guises, revealing twisted, half-formed creatures that seemed to flicker in and out of reality. "Start the ritual," I shouted to Frank, turning to face our pursuers. "I'll hold them off." As Frank began to chant, his voice rising above the inhuman screams of our attackers, I steeled myself for the fight of my life. The invasion had begun in earnest, and the next few minutes would determine the fate of our world. With a silent prayer, I charged forward to meet the oncoming horde, hoping against hope that we weren't already too late. Days blurred into nights as I tried to stay one step ahead of my relentless pursuer. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, and paranoia my constant companion. Every reflective surface was a potential gateway, every stranger a possible threat. The hunt was on, and I was both predator and prey. I found myself in a dingy motel room, the kind of place that asks no questions and expects no answers. The mirror was the first to go, shattered and covered with a threadbare blanket. Windows were blocked, and even the TV screen faced the wall. In the dim light of a single lamp, I pored over the notes Frank had given me before we were separated in the chaos at the lake. A knock at the door sent my heart racing. "Housekeeping," called a cheerful voice. I froze, barely daring to breathe. It was 3 a.m. No housekeeping would be around at this hour. "Just a minute," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady as I frantically gathered my things. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Sir, I really must insist. We've had some complaints about the room." I edged towards the bathroom, looking for an escape route. "I'm not decent. Come back later." The pounding on the door grew violent, the wood splintering under the force. Now, John," came my own voice, distorted and cruel. "Don't be rude. Let us in." With a crash, the door gave way. I caught a glimpse of my own face twisted into an inhuman grin before I dove through the bathroom window. Glass shattered around me as I hit the ground rolling, ignoring the cuts and bruises as I sprinted into the night. Behind me, I heard that terrible laughter. My laughter, but wrong. "Run all you want, John. We'll always find you." I didn't stop running until the first light of dawn touched the sky. Exhausted and bleeding, I slumped against a tree in a park I didn't recognize. As I caught my breath, an elderly woman walking her dog approached me, concern etched on her face. "Young man, are you all right? You look terrible." I tried to smile, but it felt more like a grimace. "I'm fine, ma'am, just had a rough night." She frowned, clearly not believing me. "You need help, dear? Let me call someone for you." As she reached for her phone, I caught sight of my reflection in its glossy screen. For a moment, just a split second, I saw that cruel smile again. "No," I shouted, knocking the phone from her hand. It clattered to the ground, the screen cracking. The woman recoiled, fear replacing concern. "What's wrong with you?" she cried, hurrying away with her dog. "I'm sorry," I called after her, but she was already gone. I was alone again, just as my pursuer wanted. I made my way to a public restroom, needing to clean up and assess the damage from my hasty escape. As I pushed open the door, a chill ran down my spine. Mirrors. Of course there would be mirrors. Keeping my eyes down, I moved to the sink furthest from the door. I had to risk a glance up just for a moment to check my injuries. Slowly, I raised my head. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't right. The eyes were too bright, the smile too wide. As I watched, frozen in horror, it began to move independently of me. "Thought you could hide from us, John?" It sneered. "We're always here, always watching. You opened the door, and now you can never close it." I stumbled backward, my back hitting the cold tile wall. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The reflection's grin widened impossibly. "We want what's ours, your world, your life, your very being, and we'll hound you to the ends of the earth until we get it." Its hand pressed against the glass, and to my horror I saw fingers beginning to emerge from the mirror. "No more running, John. It's time to come home." With a cry of terror, I fled the bathroom, not daring to look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, finally collapsing in an alley far from the park. As I sat there, gasping for breath, I realized the true extent of my predicament. There was nowhere I could hide, no place I could run where they couldn't find me. Every reflection, every mirrored surface, every dark window at night, they were all gateways for my pursuer. I pulled out my phone, hesitating for a moment before turning it on. The cracked screen flickered to life and, for now at least, showed only my true reflection. With trembling fingers, I dialed Frank's number. "John?" came his gruff voice. "Where are you? Are you safe?" I laughed bitterly. "Safe? I don't think that word applies to me anymore, Frank. They're everywhere. They're hunting me, and I don't know how much longer I can keep running." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Frank spoke again, his voice was low and urgent. "Listen to me, John. There might be a way to end this, but it's dangerous. Meet me at the old lighthouse on the north shore of the lake. And John, trust no one, not even me, until you're sure it's really me." As I ended the call, I felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. But it was tempered by a grim realization. To end this hunt, I would have to become the hunter, and my prey wore my own face. I pushed myself to my feet, wincing at my battered body's protests. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city. As darkness fell, I knew the hunt would intensify, but this time I would be ready. With renewed determination, I set off towards the lake, towards what I hoped would be the final confrontation. The hunter and the hunted, the pursuer and the prey, all would converge at the lighthouse. And one way or another, this nightmare would end. The old lighthouse loomed before me, a solitary sentinel against the inky black sky. Lake Tahoe stretched out behind it, a vast mirror reflecting the starless night. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached, every sense on high alert. This was it, the final confrontation. "Frank?" I called out softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you here?" A figure emerged from the shadows at the base of the lighthouse. I tensed, ready to run, but then I recognized the weathered face of my unlikely ally. "John?" Frank nodded, his eyes darting around nervously. "You made it? Did anyone follow you?" I shook my head. "I don't think so, but it's hard to be sure. They're everywhere, Frank, in every reflection, every shadow." Frank's expression grew grim. "I know, son. That's why we need to end this tonight." He pulled an ancient leather-bound tome from his bag. "This book contains the ritual that can seal the threshold, but it won't be easy." As Frank began to explain the intricacies of the ritual, a cold laugh echoed around us. We spun around, searching for the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Oh, John," my own voice mocked from the darkness. "Did you really think it would be that simple?" Suddenly, the calm surface of the lake erupted. A figure rose from the water, my doppelganger, but twisted and wrong. Its skin was pale and translucent, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Behind it, more figures emerged, each a warped reflection of someone I knew. You've led us on quite a chase, my double sneered. But playtime is over. It's time to take what's ours. Frank stepped forward, brandishing the book like a weapon. You have no power here, creature. This ends now. The doppelganger's laugh was like breaking glass. Foolish old man. We have all the power. This world is ripe for the taking, and you two are all that stand in our way. With inhuman speed, it lunged forward. I barely had time to shove Frank out of the way before my double was upon me, its cold, wet hands wrapping around my throat. "Fight it, John," Frank yelled, scrambling to his feet. "I'll start the ritual." As I grappled with my mirror image, I could hear Frank's voice rising in a strange, guttural chant. The air around us began to thicken and swirl, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. My doppelganger snarled, its face inches from mine. "You can't win, John. We are Legion, we are eternal, and we are you." I struggled to break free, my lungs burning for air. "You're not me," I gasped out. With a surge of strength born of desperation, I managed to break its grip and push it away. It stumbled back, surprise flickering across its familiar yet alien features. "Now, John," Frank shouted. "The final step of the ritual. It has to be you." I scrambled towards Frank, snatching the book from his hands. My eyes scanned the page, landing on the final incantation. As I began to read the words aloud, my voice joining Frank's in the arcane chant, the world around us seemed to shift and warp. The doppelganger screamed in unison, a sound that threatened to shatter my eardrums. They began to melt and twist, their forms becoming less solid with each word I spoke. "No!" my double cried, reaching for me with elongating liquid arms. "You don't know what you're doing. You'll destroy everything." I faltered for a moment, doubt creeping in. What if it was right? What if this ritual would cause more harm than good? "Don't listen to it, John," Frank urged. "Finish the ritual." Drawing a deep breath, I spoke the final words of the incantation. A blinding light erupted from the lighthouse, cutting through the darkness like a knife. The air itself seemed to tear open, revealing a swirling vortex of otherworldly energy. The doppelgangers were being pulled towards the vortex, their bodies stretching and distorting as they fought against its pull. My double's eyes locked with mine, filled with a mixture of hatred and fear. "This isn't over, John," it hissed as it was dragged towards the portal. "We'll find another way. Another world, another you." With a final, ear-splitting shriek, the creatures were sucked into the vortex. The tear in reality pulsed once, twice, and then began to close in on itself. As the last of the otherworldly light faded, I collapsed to my knees, exhausted beyond measure. Frank's hand on my shoulder steadied me. "We did it, son," he said, his voice filled with wonder and relief. "We sealed the threshold." I looked out over the now calm surface of the lake, hardly daring to believe it was over. "But for how long?" I asked. "You heard what it said. They'll find another way." Frank sighed heavily. "Perhaps. But that's a problem for another day. For now, we've won. The hunt is over." As the first rays of dawn began to peek over the horizon, I allowed myself a small smile. The confrontation was over, but I knew in my heart that this was just the beginning. Whatever came next, whatever threats emerged from the shadows, I would be ready. The sun rose over Lake Tahoe, its light dancing on the water's surface. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I looked at my reflection without fear. It was just me staring back, tired, battered, but unquestionably human. The battle was won, but the war, I suspected, was far from over. As the first light of dawn broke over Lake Tahoe, I stood at the water's edge, my body aching and my mind reeling from the night's events. The ritual was complete, the threshold sealed, but victory had come at a steep price. Frank limped to my side, his weathered face etched with exhaustion and something deeper, a profound sadness that made him look older than his years. "We did it, John," he said, his voice hoarse. "We saved the world." I nodded, unable to find the words to express the tumult of emotions churning inside me. Relief, yes, but also an overwhelming sense of loss. But at what cost? I finally managed to ask. Frank sighed heavily, his eyes fixed on the calm surface of the lake. There's always a price for meddling with forces beyond our understanding. We knew that going in. As if on cue, a searing pain shot through my body, causing me to double over. It felt as if my very essence was being torn apart. "John," Frank cried, reaching out to steady me. "What's wrong?" I gritted my teeth against the pain. "I don't know. It feels like I'm being pulled apart from the inside." Frank's expression grew grim. "The ritual. It must have taken more than we anticipated." As the pain subsided to a dull throb, I straightened up, my gaze drawn to a small puddle at my feet. What I saw in that reflection made my blood run cold. My face stared back at me, but it was wrong. One eye was my own, filled with fear and confusion. The other glowed with that otherworldly light I had come to associate with the doppelgangers. Half of my mouth twisted into a cruel smirk, while the other half remained frozen in horror. "Frank," I whispered, my voice shaking. "What's happening to me?" The old man's face fell, a look of guilt washing over him. "I was afraid of this. The ritual, it didn't just seal the threshold, it bound you to it." "What do you mean, bound me to it?" I demanded, panic rising in my chest. Frank placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch surprisingly cold. To close the door between worlds, the ritual needed an anchor, something of both realms to hold it shut. You, John, you were the key all along. The realization hit me like a physical blow. "You knew," I accused, stepping back from him. "You knew this would happen?" Frank nodded solemnly. "I suspected, but it was the only way to stop them. I'm sorry, John, truly I am." As anger and betrayal warred within me, another wave of pain washed over me. I fell to my knees, crying out as I felt my very being start to split. "Make it stop," I pleaded, tears streaming down my face. "There has to be a way to undo this." Frank knelt beside me, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I'm afraid there isn't. The threshold is sealed, but you're now a part of both worlds, neither fully here nor there." As the pain subsided once more, I found myself looking at my hands. One was solid, flesh and blood. The other flickered and wavered, sometimes translucent, sometimes solid. "What am I supposed to do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Frank helped me to my feet. "You learn to live with it, to control it. You're the guardian of the threshold now, John. It's your responsibility to ensure it remains closed." I laughed bitterly. "Guardian? I feel more like a prisoner." "I know it doesn't seem like it now, but this transformation, it gives you power," Frank explained. "You can see things others can't, go places they can't go. You're our first line of defense if they ever try to break through again." As if to illustrate his point, I suddenly found my vision shifting. The world around me seemed to flicker, and for a moment I could see that other place and the twisted, nightmarish version of our world. It was there, just beyond a veil I could now perceive. "I never asked for this," I said, my voice cracking. Frank's expression softened. "Heroes rarely do, son. But here we are." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I felt a strange dichotomy settling over me. Part of me longed for the normalcy of my old life, while another part, a part I was afraid to acknowledge, thrilled at the new sensations and abilities awakening within me. I turned to Frank, a question burning in my mind. How do I control this? How do I keep from losing myself entirely? The old man smiled sadly. "That, I'm afraid, is something you'll have to figure out on your own. But I'll help you as much as I can." As we stood there on the shore of Lake Tahoe, I realized that while we had won the battle, the war was far from over. The price of victory was my old life, my very humanity. But perhaps in time, I could forge something new from the pieces left behind. I caught my reflection in the lake one last time. The face that looked back was a patchwork of human and other, a visual representation of the internal struggle I now faced. But in both eyes, human and otherworldly, I saw a determination I hadn't known I possessed. "All right," I said, squaring my shoulders. "Let's get to work. We have a threshold to guard." As Frank and I walked away from the lake, I felt the weight of my new responsibility settling upon me. The price of victory had been high, but as I took my first steps into this new existence, I vowed to make it worth the cost. The battle for my soul, and for the safety of our world, had only just begun. Now let's move on to the next dark story. Leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe. The dense canopy of the Great Smoky Mountains loomed over me as I trudged through the underbrush, my camera bag slung heavily across my shoulder. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a primal aroma that usually invigorated me. But today, something felt off. "Get it together, Alex," I muttered to myself, shaking off the unease that had been dogging me since I'd set up camp the night before. I'd come here to capture the raw beauty of nature, not to jump at shadows like a scared kid. As I pushed through a particularly stubborn thicket, my foot caught on something hard and unyielding. I stumbled, barely catching myself before face-planting into the forest floor. Cursing under my breath, I turned to see what had tripped me up. That's when I saw it. Half buried in the moist earth, its weathered exterior almost indistinguishable from the surrounding detritus, lay an old camera. It was unlike any I'd ever seen before, a relic from another era, its once sleek body now marred by time and the elements. "What the hell?" I whispered, crouching down to get a better look. My fingers hesitated just above its surface, an inexplicable reluctance holding me back. Something about this camera felt wrong, as if it didn't belong here or anywhere. Against my better judgment, I reached out and grasped it. The moment my skin made contact with the cold metal, a jolt of electricity seemed to shoot up my arm. I jerked back, heart pounding. "Jesus Christ," I yelped, stumbling backward and landing hard on my ass. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the camera as if it might suddenly spring to life. But it remained motionless, half buried in the earth, silent and inscrutable. Slowly I crawled forward again, my curiosity overriding my fear. This time, when I touched the camera, there was no shock, just the cool, slightly damp feel of old metal. With trembling hands, I pried it from the ground. Clumps of dirt fell away, revealing more of its strange design. It was heavier than it looked, with an odd heft that spoke of internal mechanisms far more complex than its exterior suggested. "Where did you come from?" I murmured, turning it over in my hands. The lens was intact, miraculously unscratched despite its apparent time in the wilderness. The body bore no manufacturer's mark, no serial number, nothing to indicate its origin or age. As I examined it more closely, I noticed strange symbols etched into the metal near the viewfinder. They weren't like any language I'd ever seen, more like abstract glyphs that seemed to shift and change the longer I stared at them. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a whisper that sounded almost like words. I whipped my head around, suddenly acutely aware of how alone I was in these woods. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast silence of the forest. "Is anyone there?" No response came, save for the continued susurration of leaves in the breeze. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes were boring into me from every direction. I looked back down at the camera in my hands, a growing sense of dread pooling in my gut. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to put it back, to bury it deeper than I'd found it and run as far and as fast as I could in the opposite direction. But I couldn't. Something about this strange, ancient device had its hooks in me now. I needed to know more. With shaking fingers, I opened the back of the camera. To my surprise, there was film inside. Old, certainly, but not as degraded as I would have expected given the camera's condition. "Well," I said to myself, trying to inject some bravado into my voice, Only one way to find out what you've seen, isn't there? I carefully removed the film, tucking it into a light-proof canister in my bag. As I did so, my fingers brushed against something else inside the camera. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a whisper that sounded almost like words. I whipped my head around, suddenly acutely aware of how alone I was in these woods. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast silence of the forest. "Is anyone there?" No response came, save for the continued susurration of leaves in the breeze. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes were boring into me from every direction. I looked back down at the camera in my hands, a growing sense of dread pooling in my gut. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to put it back, to bury it deeper than I'd found it and run as far and as fast as I could in the opposite direction. But I couldn't. Something about this strange, ancient device had its hooks in me now. I needed to know more. With shaking fingers, I opened the back of the camera. To my surprise, there was film inside. Old, certainly, but not as degraded as I would have expected given the camera's condition. "Well," I said to myself, trying to inject some bravado into my voice. "Only one way to find out what you've seen, isn't there?" I carefully removed the film, tucking it into a light-proof canister in my bag. As I did so, my fingers brushed against something else inside the camera. A small, folded piece of paper tucked into a crevice. Heart pounding, I extracted it and unfolded it with utmost care. The paper was brittle, threatening to crumble at my touch. On it, in faded, spidery handwriting, were words that made my blood run cold. "Beware the eye that sees what has not yet come to pass. Once opened, it cannot be closed." I stared at the note, then at the camera, my mind reeling. What did it mean? What had I stumbled upon? As if in answer, another gust of wind swept through the clearing. This time I was certain I heard words carried on the breeze, a whispered warning that chilled me to my core. "You shouldn't have found me." I jerked to my feet, the camera clutched tightly to my chest, my eyes darting wildly around the suddenly sinister forest. Without conscious thought, I began to run, crashing through the underbrush back towards my campsite. Little did I know, with each step I took, I was running not away from danger, but headlong into a nightmare beyond my darkest imaginings. The discovery of that camera in the woods was just the beginning, the first step on a path that would lead me to question everything I thought I knew about reality, time, and the nature of fate itself. My hands shook as I hung the last photograph to dry in my makeshift darkroom, a small tent I'd set up next to my main campsite. The red glow of the safe light cast eerie shadows across the walls, making the confined space feel even more claustrophobic. "This can't be real," I muttered, my voice trembling. "It's not possible." But there they were, a series of images that defied all logic and reason. Me, sleeping peacefully in my tent, the soft glow of my lantern illuminating my features, the rumpled sleeping bag pulled up to my chin. Every detail perfect, precise, and completely impossible. I hadn't taken these photos. I couldn't have. They showed scenes that hadn't happened yet. "Get a grip, Alex," I said aloud, trying to steady myself. "There has to be a rational explanation for this." But as I stared at the images, my mind raced through increasingly implausible scenarios. Someone sneaking into my tent while I slept? No, I was a light sleeper, and I'd have noticed. An elaborate prank? But who would go to such lengths, and why? The truth was staring me in the face, as impossible as it seemed. Somehow that old camera I'd found in the woods had captured moments from the future. I stumbled out of the dark-room tent, gulping in the cool night air. The forest around me suddenly seemed alive with hidden menace, the darkness between the trees concealing untold secrets. "Hello?" I called out, half hoping and half dreading a response. "Is anyone there? Is this some kind of joke?" Only the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl answered me. I was alone, or at least as alone as one can be when faced with the impossible. Reluctantly, I ducked back into the darkroom tent. I had to examine the photos more closely, had to find some clue that would unravel this mystery. As I pored over each image, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In each successive photo, the angle changed slightly, as if the camera was slowly moving closer to me as I slept. And in the final image, oh God, I choked out, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. In the last photo, barely visible in the shadows at the edge of the frame, was a figure. Indistinct, blurry, but unmistakably there, watching me sleep. I scrambled backwards, knocking over the safe light and plunging the tent into darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for the zipper, desperate to escape the suffocating confines of the tent. As I burst out into the night, a twig snapped in the forest behind me. I whirled around, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "Show yourself!" Silence. Then, carried on the wind, a whisper so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. Not yet. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my main tent, every sound making me flinch, every shadow seeming to conceal that indistinct figure from the photograph. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I finally succumbed to exhaustion, falling into a fitful sleep. When I woke, for a blissful moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But then I saw the old camera, sitting innocuously on my camping table, and the events of the previous night came rushing back. With trembling hands, I picked up the camera, turning it over and over, searching for some clue to its origins, its purpose. The strange symbols I'd noticed before seemed to shimmer in the morning light, almost as if they were moving. "What are you?" I whispered to the camera. "How is this possible?" As if in response, I heard a click. The shutter had activated on its own. Driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain, I immediately set up my darkroom tent again. As I developed this new photo, a sense of dread grew in the pit of my stomach. When the image finally emerged, I staggered back, my legs giving out beneath me. The photo showed me, sitting in this very tent, developing this very picture. The timestamp in the corner of the frame was exactly 1 hour in the future. "This can't be happening," I said, my voice barely audible. "This isn't real. It can't be real." But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that it was real. Somehow, this camera was capturing moments that hadn't happened yet. And if that was true, then the other photos, the ones of me sleeping, the shadowy figure watching, they were glimpses of a future yet to come. A future I now desperately wanted to avoid. As I sat there, surrounded by impossible images of things yet to be, a realization dawned on me. This camera wasn't just a curious artifact or a supernatural oddity. It was a window into fate itself. And somewhere in these photos, in the images yet to be taken, lay the key to my survival. Because if this camera could show me the future, maybe, just maybe, I could change it. Little did I know, as I steeled myself to face the impossible, that my battle against fate was only just beginning. The photos were a warning, a glimpse into a future fraught with danger. But they were also a challenge, a chance to rewrite destiny itself. As I packed up my camp, preparing to delve deeper into this mystery, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That somewhere in the shadows of the forest or the folds of time itself, that indistinct figure was waiting, watching, and perhaps plotting my downfall. The game was on, and the stakes were nothing less than my very existence. My hands trembled as I held the final photograph, the image searing itself into my mind with horrifying clarity. There I was, sprawled on the forest floor, eyes wide and lifeless, a look of terror frozen on my face. The timestamp in the corner mocked me. 3 days from now. "No," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "This can't be how it ends." But the evidence was right there in my hands, an incontrovertible glimpse into a future I desperately wanted to avoid. I felt the weight of my mortality pressing down on me, each tick of my watch a countdown to that fatal moment captured in the photograph. I paced the small clearing where I'd set up camp, the rustle of leaves underfoot a constant reminder of the forest that now felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. Every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat, every sound a harbinger of my impending doom. "Think, Alex, think," I muttered to myself, running my hands through my hair. There has to be a way out of this. But the more I pondered my situation, the more hopeless it seemed. How does one fight against fate itself? How do you change a future that seems already written? As night fell, I found myself unable to sleep, the image of my own corpse haunting me every time I closed my eyes. I sat by the dying embers of my campfire, the old camera clutched tightly in my hands like a talisman. "Why me?" I asked the darkness, not really expecting an answer. "Why show me this if I can't change it?" A twig snapped in the forest behind me, and I whirled around, heart pounding. For a moment I thought I saw movement in the shadows, a flicker of something just beyond the reach of the firelight. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. Silence answered me, broken only by the soft hoot of a distant owl. I turned back to the fire, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But the unease lingered, a constant companion to the dread that had taken up residence in my chest. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I made a decision. I couldn't just sit here and wait for death to come. I had to do something, anything, to try and change the course of events. I packed up my camp with feverish intensity, stuffing everything haphazardly into my backpack. As I worked, I talked to myself, trying to formulate a plan. "Okay, Alex, think logically. The photo shows you in this forest, so maybe if you leave, if you go somewhere else, you can avoid it." It seemed like a sound plan, but as I hefted my backpack onto my shoulders, doubt gnawed at me. Could it really be that simple? I set off down the trail, my pace quick and determined. With each step, I felt like I was outrunning death itself, putting distance between myself and that grim future captured in the photograph. But as the day wore on, strange things began to happen. My usually reliable GPS started malfunctioning, leading me in circles. Trails that should have led out of the forest somehow brought me back to familiar clearings. It was as if the very woods were conspiring to keep me here, to ensure that the future played out as predicted. As the sun began to set, I found myself back in the same clearing where I'd started, despite hours of walking in what I thought was the opposite direction. Exhausted and disheartened, I slumped to the ground, the weight of inevitability crushing down on me. "I can't escape it, can I?" I said to the encroaching darkness. "No matter what I do, I'm going to end up right back here." As if in response, I heard the click of the camera's shutter. With trembling hands, I raised it to my eye and took a look. The image in the viewfinder made my blood run cold. It showed me, sitting exactly where I was now, looking through the camera. But in the background, barely visible in the growing darkness, was a figure. The same indistinct shape I'd seen in the earlier photographs. I lowered the camera slowly, my eyes scanning the tree line. There, just at the edge of my vision, I saw movement, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness of the forest. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't respond, but I could feel its gaze upon me, heavy and expectant. As I watched, it raised an arm, pointing off into the forest. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it melted back into the shadows. I sat there for a long moment, my mind reeling. Was this mysterious figure trying to help me? Or was it leading me towards my doom? In the end, I realized I had no choice. Staying here, paralyzed by fear, would only ensure that the fatal photograph came to pass. At least by following the figure's direction, I was taking action, trying to change my fate. With a deep breath, I got to my feet, shouldered my pack, and stepped in the direction the figure had indicated. As I moved deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around me, the darkness becoming almost tangible. "I'm not going down without a fight," I said to the night, trying to inject some bravado into my voice. "You hear me, whatever you are? I'm going to change this future no matter what it takes." But even as I spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap, that every step I took was bringing me closer to that final, fatal moment captured in the photograph. The looming specter of my own death hung over me, a constant reminder of what was at stake. As I pushed through the underbrush, I realized that the next 2 days would determine everything. Would I find a way to change my fate? Or was I merely playing out a script that had already been written, marching inexorably towards my own demise? Only time would tell. And time, it seemed, was not on my side. The forest seemed to close in around me as I trudged forward, my mind racing with possibilities and fears. Each step felt like a gamble, a roll of the dice against fate itself. But I knew I couldn't stop. The mystery of the camera and my impending doom drove me onward, even as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me. There has to be a connection, I muttered to myself, my voice barely audible over the crunch of leaves underfoot. The camera, the photos, that figure, it's all linked somehow. I'd been walking for hours, following the vague direction the shadowy figure had pointed. The trees all looked the same, an endless sea of bark and leaves. But just as I was about to give up hope, I stumbled into a small clearing. At its center stood an ancient, gnarled oak tree, its trunk twisted into an almost humanoid shape. As I approached, I noticed something carved into the bark, the same strange symbols I'd seen on the camera. What the hell? I breathed, reaching out to trace the markings with my fingertips. The moment I touched the tree, a jolt of energy surged through me. Images flashed before my eyes, the camera being crafted by hands shrouded in mist, a hooded figure taking photos of horrific events yet to come, people desperately trying to change their fates, only to meet their doom in increasingly bizarre ways. I jerked my hand back, gasping for air. Jesus Christ, I panted, stumbling backwards. What was that? That, came a voice from behind me, was a glimpse into the truth you seek. I whirled around to find an old man standing at the edge of the clearing. His weathered face was kind, but his eyes held a depth of sadness that made my heart ache. "Who are you?" I demanded, my hand instinctively tightening around the camera in my bag. "Do you know something about this?" The old man smiled wryly. "I know more than I wish I did, young man. My name is Elias, and I've been waiting for someone like you for a very long time." He gestured for me to sit on a fallen log, and despite my reservations, I found myself complying. There was something about Elias that commanded trust. "The camera you found," he began, his voice low and gravelly, "is not of this world. It was created by beings who exist outside of time as we know it. They see all possible futures and, for reasons beyond our understanding, sometimes choose to intervene." I listened, transfixed, as Elias spun a tale that sounded more like fantasy than reality. He spoke of ancient cults dedicated to these beings, of rituals performed to gain glimpses of the future, and of the terrible price that came with such knowledge. "But why me?" I interrupted, frustration boiling over. "Why show me my own death if I can't change it?" Elias fixed me with a penetrating gaze. "Who says you can't change it?" Hope flared in my chest, quickly tempered by suspicion. "The photos. They've all come true so far, and everything I've done to try and avoid it has just led me back here." "Ah," Elias nodded. "But that's the trap, you see. The future isn't set in stone. It's malleable, but only if you understand the rules of the game." He went on to explain that the camera didn't just show the future, it showed possible futures. Each photo was a potential outcome, not a certainty. But the very act of trying to avoid that future often led people right into it. "It's like quicksand," Elias said, his eyes distant. "The more you struggle against it, the deeper you sink. The trick is to work with it, not against it." As night fell, Elias and I continued to talk. He told me of others who had found the camera over the years, of their struggles and, more often than not, their failures. But he also spoke of a few who had managed to change their fates, to rewrite the future that had seemed so certain. "The key," he said, leaning in close, is to understand that the camera doesn't control your fate. It merely shows you possibilities. Your choices, your actions, they're what truly shape your future. As Elias spoke, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. For the first time since finding the camera, I felt a glimmer of hope. But what about the figure I saw? I asked. The one in the photos and in the forest. Elias's face darkened. Ah yes, the Watcher. It's drawn to those who use the camera, feeding off the fear and desperation of those trying to change their fates. It's dangerous, make no mistake, but it's not invincible. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden charm. Take this, he said, pressing it into my hand. It won't protect you entirely, but it will help shield you from the Watcher's influence. As I took the charm, another jolt of energy passed through me. But this time, instead of terrifying visions, I saw flashes of possibility, myself overcoming the fate shown in the photos, standing triumphant against the shadowy figure. Thank you, I said, my voice thick with emotion. But why are you helping me? Elias stood, his joints creaking. Because long ago I was in your shoes. I found the camera, saw my death, and thought all was lost. Someone helped me then, showed me the truth. Now I pass that knowledge on to you. As he turned to leave, I called out, Wait, what do I do now? How do I change my fate? Elias paused at the edge of the clearing. You already have the tools you need, Alex. The camera, the knowledge I've given you, and most importantly, your own will. Remember, the future you saw is just one possibility. Your choices from here on out will determine which future comes to pass. With that, he disappeared into the darkness of the forest, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the weight of my newfound knowledge. As I sat there, the camera a heavy presence in my bag and Elias's charm clutched tightly in my hand, I realized that unraveling this mystery was just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, using what I'd learned to change my fate and confront the Watcher. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a spark of determination. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it. The game had changed, and this time I intended to win. The weight of Elias's words hung heavy in my mind as I set out the next morning. The forest, once a place of beauty and solitude, now felt like an elaborate maze designed to trap me. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shadow cast by the towering trees, seemed to whisper of impending doom. Focus, Alex, I muttered to myself, checking the timestamp on the fatal photograph for what felt like the 1,000th time. You've got less than 48 hours to change your fate. I had spent the night poring over the photos, searching for any clue that might help me avoid the grim future they portrayed. But with each passing hour, I felt the noose of time tightening around my neck. As I hiked through a particularly dense part of the forest, I heard a twig snap behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound brave. No answer came, but I could have sworn I saw a flicker of movement in the shadows. The Watcher. It had to be. "I'm not afraid of you," I shouted, though the quaver in my voice betrayed my true feelings. "I know about you now. I know this future isn't set in stone." As if in response, I heard the unmistakable click of the camera's shutter. With shaking hands, I pulled it out of my bag and looked at the viewfinder. The image made my blood run cold. It showed me, standing exactly where I was now, but behind me loomed a dark, indistinct figure, the Watcher, closer than it had ever been before. I spun around but saw nothing but trees and shadows. The feeling of being watched, however, intensified. "Leave me alone," I screamed into the forest. "I'm going to change this future, do you hear me? I'm not going to die." My words echoed through the trees, met only by an eerie silence. Even the birds had stopped singing. I felt like I was shouting into a void, challenging an enemy I couldn't see or understand. As the day wore on, I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. The camera continued to click periodically, each new image showing the Watcher drawing ever closer. By nightfall, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I set up camp in a small clearing, building a fire more for comfort than warmth. As I sat there, staring into the flames, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running out of time. "What am I missing?" I asked the crackling fire. "There has to be a way to change this." Just then I heard a rustling in the bushes. I leapt to my feet, grabbing a burning branch from the fire to use as a makeshift weapon. "Show yourself," I demanded, waving the flaming stick in front of me. To my surprise, a young woman stumbled out of the undergrowth. She looked as startled to see me as I was to see her. "Who are you?" I asked, lowering the branch but not letting go of it entirely. "I'm Sarah," she said, her voice hoarse. "I've been lost in these woods for days. I found this camera, and ever since then, strange things have been happening." My heart skipped a beat. "You found a camera? Like this one?" I pulled out the ancient device to show her. Her eyes widened in recognition. "Yes, exactly like that. Have you been seeing the impossible photos too?" For the next hour, Sarah and I exchanged stories. She had found a similar camera a week ago and had been plagued by prophetic photographs ever since. But unlike me, she hadn't seen an image of her own death. "Maybe that's it," I said, more to myself than to her. "Maybe the key is to not be alone. The photo shows me dying alone in the forest, but now you're here." Sarah nodded slowly. "It's worth a shot. But Alex, we need to be careful. I've seen things in these woods, shadows that move on their own, whispers in the dark." "The Watcher," I said grimly. "It's drawn to people who use these cameras. But together, maybe we stand a chance against it." As we talked late into the night, formulating plans and theories, I felt a glimmer of hope. The oppressive feeling of racing against time eased somewhat. With Sarah by my side, the future no longer felt quite so set in stone. But as dawn broke, bringing me one day closer to the timestamp on that fatal photograph, I knew we couldn't let our guard down. The Watcher was still out there, and time was still ticking away. "We need to move," I said, quickly packing up our camp. "Every second counts now." Sarah nodded, her face set with determination. "Where to?" I paused, considering. Then I remembered Elias's words about working with fate, not against it. "To the place in the photograph," I said firmly. "If we're going to change the future, we need to face it head on." As we set off, the weight of the camera in my bag felt lighter somehow. The race against time was still on, but now at least I wasn't running alone. Whatever the next 24 hours held, whatever challenges the Watcher might throw our way, we would face them together. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to change my fate. Sarah and I pushed through the dense undergrowth, our eyes constantly scanning the shadows for any sign of the Watcher. The forest seemed to close in around us, the air thick with tension and the weight of impending doom. "We're close," I said, checking the fatal photograph against our surroundings. "The clearing where it's supposed to happen should be just ahead." Sarah nodded grimly. "What's the plan when we get there, Alex?" I hesitated. Despite our discussions and theories, I still felt woefully unprepared. "I'm not entirely sure," I admitted, "but I think we need to confront it head on. Maybe if we can understand why this is happening, we can change the outcome." As we stepped into the clearing, a chill ran down my spine. It was exactly as the photograph had shown. The gnarled tree roots, the moss-covered rocks, the small stream trickling nearby, the scene of my predicted death. "This is it," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Sarah squeezed my arm reassuringly. "We're going to change this, Alex. Remember what you told me about Elias? The future isn't set in stone." Just then, we heard the telltale click of a camera shutter. Both of our devices had activated simultaneously. With trembling hands, I raised my camera to look at the viewfinder. The image showed Sarah and me, standing exactly where we were, but behind us loomed a dark, indistinct figure, the Watcher closer than ever before. "Sarah," I said, my voice tight with fear, "look behind us." Slowly, we turned in unison, And there it was, a shadow darker than the surrounding forest, vaguely humanoid but somehow wrong. It seemed to flicker and shift, as if it wasn't fully present in our reality. "What do you want from us?" Sarah called out, her voice surprisingly steady. The figure didn't respond, but I felt a pressure building in my head, accompanied by a cacophony of whispers just beyond the edge of comprehension. "It's trying to communicate," I gasped, dropping to my knees as the pressure intensified. Sarah knelt beside me, her hand on my shoulder. "Fight it, Alex. Remember what Elias said. Our choices shape our future. Don't let it control you." Her words cut through the mental fog, giving me strength. I pushed back against the psychic assault, focusing on my determination to change my fate. Suddenly the pressure vanished, and the Watcher seemed to recoil. In that moment of clarity, I had an epiphany. "The cameras," I said, struggling to my feet. "They're not just showing the future, they're shaping it. Every time we look at a photo, we're reinforcing that possible future." Sarah's eyes widened in understanding. "So if we destroy them, we might break its hold on us," I finished. Without hesitation, we both raised our cameras high and smashed them against the nearby rocks. The devices shattered, ancient gears and inexplicable mechanisms spilling out onto the forest floor. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The air itself seemed to ripple, and the Watcher's form became even more unstable, flickering in and out of existence. "It's working!" Sarah exclaimed. "Keep going." We gathered the broken pieces of the cameras and threw them into the stream, watching as they were swept away by the current. With each piece that disappeared, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. But our victory was short-lived. The Watcher, though weakened, was still present. It began to advance on us, its form solidifying with each step. "No," I said, standing my ground. "You don't control us anymore. Our fate is our own." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the charm Elias had given me. It hummed with energy in my palm. "Sarah," I said, never taking my eyes off the approaching figure, "take my hand." As our fingers intertwined, I felt a surge of power. The charm began to glow, brighter and brighter, until it was painful to look at. The Watcher stopped its advance, seeming to shrink back from the light. The whispers in my mind returned, but this time they were clear. The cycle. Broken. Freedom. With a sound like reality itself tearing, the Watcher imploded, collapsing in on itself until nothing remained but a faint distortion in the air. For a long moment, Sarah and I stood in stunned silence, our hands still clasped tightly together. Is it over?" Sarah finally whispered. I looked down at my watch. The timestamp from the fatal photograph had come and gone. I was still alive. "I think so," I said, a smile slowly spreading across my face. "We did it. We changed fate." As the realization sank in, we both began to laugh, a release of tension, fear, and disbelief. We had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. But even as we celebrated, I couldn't shake the feeling that our encounter with the Watcher and the mysterious cameras was part of something larger, something we still didn't fully understand. "What now?" Sarah asked, voicing the question that was on both our minds. I looked out into the forest, which now seemed less threatening, almost welcoming. "Now," I said, "we find Elias. I have a feeling he has more to tell us about what just happened." As we gathered our belongings and prepared to leave the clearing, I took one last look at the spot where I was supposed to have died. The future was no longer written. We had altered fate itself. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. The power to shape our destiny lay in our own hands, and that was a responsibility I was now ready to embrace. The forest had never seemed so alive, so vibrant, as it did in these last precious hours. Every leaf, every shaft of sunlight filtering through the canopy felt significant. I was acutely aware that each breath could be my last, each step potentially leading me to the fate I'd seen in that chilling photograph. Sarah and I had been trekking for hours, searching for any sign of Elias. The old man's wisdom now seemed like our only hope of truly understanding what we were up against. "Alex," Sarah called out, her voice tight with concern. "Look at your watch." I glanced down, my heart sinking. Only 1 hour remained until the timestamp on the fatal photo. "We're running out of time," I muttered, trying to keep the panic from my voice. Sarah grabbed my arm, forcing me to look at her. "Remember what we learned. The future isn't set. We can change this." I nodded, drawing strength from her determination. "You're right. Let's keep moving." As we pushed on, the forest around us began to change subtly. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out more and more of the sky. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. "Do you feel that?" I asked Sarah, my skin prickling with goosebumps. She nodded, her eyes wide. "It's like reality is thinning somehow." Just then we heard a voice calling out from deeper in the woods. "This way. Quickly now." "Elias?" I shouted back, hope surging through me. We broke into a run, following the sound of the old man's voice. As we crashed through the underbrush, the world around us seemed to warp and shift. Shadows moved in impossible ways, and more than once I could have sworn I saw figures flitting just at the edge of my vision. Finally, we burst into a small clearing. Elias stood at its center, his weathered face grave. "You've done well to make it this far," he said, "but the real test is yet to come." I glanced at my watch again. 30 minutes left. "Elias, please," I begged. "Tell us how to stop this. How do we change the future?" The old man sighed heavily. "It's not about changing the future, Alex. It's about accepting all possible futures and choosing your path." Before I could ask what he meant, a bone-chilling shriek pierced the air. The Watcher had found us. "It's here," Sarah whispered, pressing close to my side. Elias nodded grimly. "The moment of choice is upon us. Alex, you must face the Watcher alone." "What? No!" Sarah protested, but Elias held up a hand to silence her. "This is his journey," he said firmly. "We can support him, but the final choice must be his." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "What do I need to do?" Elias placed a hand on my shoulder, his eyes boring into mine. "When the Watcher appears, you'll be presented with visions, possible futures, some beautiful, some terrifying. You must not let them control you. Remember, they are all equally real and equally false." "I don't understand," I said, frustration creeping into my voice. "You will," Elias assured me. "Trust your instincts, Alex. The power has always been within you." Another shriek, closer this time. The air in the clearing began to ripple and distort. "It's time," Elias said, stepping back. "We'll be right here with you, Alex, but the journey is yours alone." As if on cue, the Watcher materialized in the center of the clearing. Its form was more solid now, a swirling vortex of darkness that hurt to look at directly. I stepped forward, my heart pounding, but my resolve firm. "I'm ready," I declared, though to whom I wasn't sure. The moment I locked eyes with the Watcher, the world fell away. I was assaulted by a cascade of visions, myself, old and gray, surrounded by loved ones, my broken body, lying in the forest exactly as the photograph had shown. A version of me consumed by the darkness, becoming a Watcher myself. Endless variations of lives lived, choices made, paths taken and not taken. Each vision felt real, felt true. I could feel myself being pulled towards them, tempted to accept one as my fate. "Choose," a voice echoed in my mind. "Choose your future." For a moment I was overwhelmed. How could I possibly choose? But then I remembered Elias's words. They were all equally real and equally false. "No," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I choose none of these futures, and all of them." The visions flickered, the Watcher's form wavering. "I choose to live in the present," I continued, feeling power building within me. to shape my future with each decision I make. The only moment that truly exists is now. As I spoke these words, I felt a fundamental shift in my understanding of reality. The future wasn't a fixed point to be seen or changed. It was an ever-evolving possibility, shaped by our choices in each moment. The Watcher let out an unearthly wail, its form beginning to unravel. "You have no power over me," I declared. "My fate is my own." With a sound like shattering glass, the Watcher exploded into countless fragments of light, each one a possible future dispersing into the ether. I blinked, finding myself back in the clearing. Sarah and Elias were staring at me in awe. "You did it," Sarah whispered, rushing to embrace me. Elias nodded, a proud smile on his face. "You've understood the true nature of time and fate, Alex. The future is not set, but neither is it completely free. It's a dance between possibility and choice." I looked down at my watch. The fateful timestamp had come and gone. I was alive, and more importantly, I was free. "What happens now?" I asked, feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. Elias chuckled. Now you live, Alex. You make choices. You shape your path. And perhaps, someday, you'll help another lost soul understand the nature of fate and time." As we made our way out of the forest, I felt a profound sense of peace. The weight of predestination had been lifted from my shoulders. The future was unwritten, full of possibility, and I was ready to meet it, one moment at a time. Now let's move on to the next dark story. Leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe. The morning air was crisp as we set out on what should have been a routine weekend trek through Yosemite. 5 of us, longtime friends bound by a love of nature and adventure, eagerly shouldered our packs, blissfully unaware of the nightmare that awaited. "Hey Sam, you got the trail map?" called out Mike, our self-appointed leader. I patted my jacket pocket, feeling the reassuring crinkle of paper. "All set? Though I doubt we'll need it. You've hiked this route how many times now?" Mike grinned, his teeth flashing white against his tanned skin. "Enough to do it blindfolded, but you never know when Mother Nature might throw us a curveball." If only we'd known how prophetic those words would become. The first few hours were everything we'd hoped for. Towering sequoias stretched endlessly above us, their ancient bark telling silent stories of centuries past. Shafts of golden sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with warmth. The gentle babble of a nearby stream provided a soothing soundtrack to our journey. "God, I needed this," sighed Elena, taking a deep breath of pine-scented air. "The office has been suffocating lately." "Tell me about it," chimed in Danny, adjusting her backpack straps. "Sometimes I think we're not meant to be cooped up in cubicles all day. This is living." We all murmured in agreement, feeling the stresses of our daily lives melting away with each step deeper into the wilderness. Even Craig, usually the most reserved of our group, seemed to be opening up, pointing out interesting flora and sharing tidbits about the park's ecology. As we began our ascent towards the summit, a subtle shift occurred. At first it was barely noticeable, a slight haze on the horizon, a faint acrid scent carried on the breeze. We dismissed it, caught up in the exhilaration of the climb and the promise of the view awaiting us. "Is it just me, or is it getting warmer?" Elena asked, wiping sweat from her brow. I frowned, realizing she was right. The temperature had been steadily climbing, well beyond what our exertion could account for. "Probably just a pocket of warm air," I offered, trying to convince myself as much as her. But as we neared the summit, an uneasy feeling began to gnaw at the pit of my stomach. The haze had thickened considerably, and the smell of smoke was now unmistakable. "Guys," Craig's voice was tight with concern, "I think there might be a fire somewhere nearby." We quickened our pace, driven by a mixture of curiosity and growing apprehension. As we crested the final ridge, the sight that greeted us stole the breath from our lungs. A perfect ring of fire encircled the valley below, closing in with a precision that defied explanation. The flames danced and swayed, but their advance was methodical, almost mechanical. Nature doesn't move like that. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Something was terribly, unthinkably wrong. What the hell? Mike breathed. His usual confidence shattered. Danny fumbled for her phone, fingers trembling as she tried to dial emergency services. No signal, she choked out, panic rising in her voice. How is there no signal? I stood transfixed, unable to tear my eyes away from the impossibility before us. The fire formed a complete circle with no break or variation in its width. At its center lay a small area of untouched forest. Our prison, I realized with growing horror. We need to go back, Elena said, her words barely audible over the distant roar of the flames. We need to get out of here now. But as we turned to retrace our steps, a wall of smoke rose up before us, cutting off our escape route. The fire was hurting us, I realized. It wanted us in that circle. This can't be happening, Craig muttered, his face ashen. Fires don't behave like this. It's not possible. Yet the evidence was undeniable. As we watched, helpless, the ring of fire continued its inexorable advance, consuming everything in its path with unnatural hunger. What do we do? Danny asked, her eyes wide with fear as she turned to Mike. For once, our fearless leader had no answer. He stared at the inferno, jaw clenched, the firelight casting deep shadows across his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. We go down. Into the center. It's our only chance. As we began our descent, picking our way carefully down the steep slope, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap. The smoke grew thicker, stinging our eyes and scratching our throats. Through the haze, I caught glimpses of movement, shapes that seemed too fluid, too purposeful to be mere tricks of the light. Did you see that? I gasped, pointing towards a flickering shadow. See what? Elena asked, her voice trembling. But before I could answer, a sound rose above the crackling flames. A low, rhythmic chanting carried on the superheated air. It was then I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that this was no accident, no freak of nature. We were being hunted. As night fell, the fire's unnatural glow cast long, writhing shadows across our makeshift camp. We huddled together in the small clearing, the ring of flames pressing in from all sides. The heat was oppressive, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. We need to conserve water, Mike said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. Take small sips, only when absolutely necessary. I nodded, clutching my half-empty bottle like a lifeline. The fire had cut us off from any streams or sources of fresh water. What we had would have to last. Elena sat with her knees pulled to her chest, rocking slightly. This isn't real, she muttered. This can't be real. I reached out to touch her shoulder, trying to offer some comfort, but she flinched away. The firelight made her eyes look wild, almost feral. Hey, I said softly. We're going to get through this. Help will come. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they rang hollow. Who could help us here? Who would even know where to look? Craig paced the perimeter of our small safe zone, his scientist's mind clearly working overtime. The precision of the fire's movement defies all known principles of wildfire behavior, he mused. It's as if it's being controlled, directed somehow. That's impossible, Danny snapped, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. You're talking about it like it's alive or something. Craig turned to her, his face eerily calm in the flickering light. At this point, Danny, I'm not ruling anything out. A tense silence fell over the group, broken only by the constant roar of the flames. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, studied like insects under glass. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking presence. Every gust of wind carried whispers just beyond understanding. Did you hear that? I asked suddenly, sitting up straight. Mike frowned. Hear what? I strained my ears, trying to catch it again. I thought I heard chanting, like someone was singing, but in a language I didn't recognize. Elena let out a strangled laugh. Great. Sam's losing it. We're all going to die here, and Sam's hearing things. I'm not losing it, I insisted, a chill running down my spine despite the heat. I know what I heard. Danny stood up abruptly. I need to try the phone again. Maybe if I climb that ridge I can get a signal. Mike grabbed her arm. No way. We stick together. Going off alone is too dangerous. Dangerous? Danny's voice rose hysterically. We're surrounded by fire. How could it possibly get more dangerous? As if in answer to her question, a sound cut through the night. A low, inhuman growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We all froze, eyes darting around the clearing. What was that? Elena whispered, her face pale. Craig swallowed hard. Mountain lion, maybe. The fire could be driving wildlife towards us. But we all knew that sound wasn't made by any mountain lion. It was too deep, too otherworldly. It spoke of ancient hungers and primal fears. We need to get out of here, Danny said, her earlier bravado evaporating. Now, I don't care how, we just need to go. Mike shook his head. And go where? That fire ring is at least a mile wide in every direction. We'd never make it through. So we just sit here and wait to die? Elena's voice cracked. I stood up, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. No one is dying. We just need to think this through. There has to be a way out. We just haven't found it yet. But as I looked at the faces of my friends, illuminated by the hellish glow of the encroaching flames, I saw my own fear and uncertainty reflected back at me. We were trapped, not just physically, but mentally. The fire had us cornered like prey, and some primal part of our brains knew it. As the night wore on, sleep became impossible. Every crack of a burning branch made us jump. The smoke grew thicker, making our eyes water and our lungs burn. And always that sense of being watched. Does anyone else feel like... Craig started, then hesitated. Like what? I prompted. He looked around nervously before continuing. Like the fire is... thinking? I know it sounds crazy, but I swear I've seen patterns in the flames. Movements that seem almost deliberate. I wanted to dismiss his words as the ramblings of an overtired, stressed mind, but I couldn't, because I'd seen it too. Flickers and swirls that seemed to form faces, reaching tendrils of flame that pulled back just before touching our sanctuary. If the fire is thinking, Mike said slowly, then what is it thinking about? The silence that followed was deafening, because we all knew the answer, even if none of us dared say it aloud. The fire was thinking about us, planning, waiting. As dawn broke, casting an eerie red glow through the smoke-filled sky, we were no closer to understanding our situation or finding a way out. Exhausted, dehydrated, and on the edge of panic, we could only watch as the ring of fire continued its slow, inexorable advance. We were trapped, yes, but I was beginning to fear that this was only the beginning of our ordeal. Whatever force had brought us here, whatever intelligence lurked behind those flames, it wasn't finished with us yet, not by a long shot. As the oppressive heat of midday bore down on us, desperation drove us to action. We couldn't just sit and wait for the fire to close in. We had to find a way out, or at least understand what we were up against. We should split up, Mike suggested, his voice raw from smoke inhalation. Cover more ground, look for any weak points in the fire line. Elena shook her head vehemently. No way. Haven't you seen any horror movies? Splitting up is how people die. Under normal circumstances, we might have laughed at her comment. But there was nothing normal about our situation, and the thought of facing this nightmare alone sent a chill through me despite the sweltering temperature. We stick together, I said firmly. But Mike's right. We need to explore. There has to be something we're missing. We set out, skirting the edge of our shrinking safe zone. The smoke was thicker now, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. We moved slowly, every sense on high alert for any sign of danger or salvation. That's when Craig stumbled, nearly falling face first into the underbrush. What the... He started, then froze. Guys, you need to see this. We gathered around, and I felt my blood run cold. Half buried in the leaf litter was a crude wooden mask, its features twisted into a grotesque grimace. Stranger still were the symbols carved into its surface, angular, alien designs that hurt the eyes to look at directly. "What is that?" Danny whispered, taking an involuntary step back. I reached out to touch it, then thought better of it. It looks old, but not ancient, like someone made this recently, trying to mimic something much older. Mike frowned. But who would be out here making masks, and why? Before anyone could answer, a gust of wind parted the smoke momentarily, revealing a narrow path we hadn't noticed before. Without a word, we began to follow it, drawn forward by a mix of curiosity and mounting dread. The path led us to a clearing, and as we stepped into it, the air seemed to grow even thicker, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. What we saw there would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Crude symbols were carved into the surrounding trees, the wounds still oozing sap. They matched the designs on the mask, but seeing them repeated, larger, made their wrongness even more apparent. They seemed to writhe and shift when viewed from the corner of the eye, as if alive. At the center of the clearing stood a makeshift altar, a flat stone slab supported by rough-hewn logs. Its surface was stained dark with what could only be blood, mixed with ash into a grisly paste. "Oh God," Elena choked out, turning away to retch. I wanted to comfort her, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene, because scattered around the altar were objects, things that didn't belong in this forest. A child's teddy bear, charred and missing an eye. A woman's high-heeled shoe, the leather cracked and peeling. A man's watch, its face shattered but hands forever frozen at 3:33. "These are trophies," Craig said, his scientific detachment crumbling in the face of this horror. "Whoever did this, they've done it before, multiple times." Mike picked up a scrap of paper that had been weighed down by a rock. His hands shook as he read aloud. "The circle must be unbroken. The Ancient One hungers. 5 souls to feed the flame." A heavy silence fell over us as the implications sank in. 5 souls. There were 5 of us. "This can't be real," Danny said, her voice rising in panic. "This has to be some sick joke, right? A prank or—" Her words were cut off by a sound that chilled us to our cores. Chanting, distant but growing closer. The same otherworldly language I'd heard whispered on the wind, but now clear and purposeful. "We need to go," I said urgently. "Now. Back to camp." As we turned to flee, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. Partially hidden behind the altar was a modern gasoline can, its red plastic incongruous among the primitive trappings of the site. "Wait," I said, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run. I approached the can, my heart pounding. Attached to its handle was a small electronic device, blinking steadily. "It's a remote ignition system," Craig said, peering over my shoulder. "Sophisticated, military grade even." The pieces started to fall into place in my mind, forming a picture too terrible to fully comprehend. This wasn't just some isolated cult in the woods. This was organized, planned. The unnatural precision of the fire, the sophisticated technology hidden among primitive rituals. We were caught in the middle of something far bigger and more dangerous than we could have imagined. "Guys," Elena's trembling voice cut through my thoughts. "Look at the trees." We turned, following her gaze, and felt the last shreds of hope drain away. The carvings on the trees were changing, the sap flowing faster, forming new patterns before our eyes. And in those patterns I saw our faces, crude, distorted, but unmistakably us. They knew we were coming, I whispered, the horrible truth dawning on me. This wasn't random. We were chosen. The chanting grew louder, and with it came the crackle of flames. The fire was advancing again, herding us back towards the center of its unnatural circle. As we ran, fleeing back to the false safety of our camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a threshold. We had glimpsed the design behind our torment, and in doing so, had become even more deeply ensnared in its web. Our discovery had brought us no closer to escape. Instead, it had revealed the true depth of the nightmare we were living, and I feared that the worst was yet to come. The chanting grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere at once. We huddled in our dwindling safe zone, watching the smoke swirl and twist in unnatural patterns. Then, as if emerging from the very air itself, they appeared. Figures in tattered robes materialized from the haze, their faces hidden behind wooden masks eerily similar to the one we'd found earlier. They moved with an inhuman grace, gliding rather than walking, encircling us with practiced precision. "Oh God," Elena whimpered, pressing closer to me. "This can't be happening." I wanted to comfort her, to say something reassuring, but my voice failed me, because as I looked at these spectral figures, I realized with growing horror that their robes were moving, writhing, as if alive with countless unseen insects. One of the figures stepped forward, its mask more elaborate than the others. When it spoke, its voice was a discordant chorus, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. "The circle is complete. The offering has been prepared." Mike, ever our leader, found his voice first. "Who are you? What do you want with us?" The masked figure tilted its head, an unsettlingly bird-like motion. "We are the keepers of the eternal flame, and you," it paused, sweeping an arm to encompass our group, "are the kindling that will awaken our God." "This is insane," Craig muttered, his scientific mind struggling to process what was happening. "You can't possibly believe." "Belief?" The figure's laugh was like grinding stone. "We do not believe. We know. For millennia, we have tended the embers, waiting for this moment. The stars have aligned, and the Ancient One stirs in its slumber." As it spoke, the other robed figures began to sway, their chanting growing more fervent. The fire responded, pulsing and writhing in time with their movements. Danny, always the most practical of us, stepped forward. "Look, there's been a mistake. We're just hikers. We don't want any part of whatever this is. Just let us go, and we won't tell anyone what we've seen." The lead figure's mask seemed to grin, though its features hadn't changed. "Oh, child, you were chosen long ago. Your paths were shaped, your steps guided, all to bring you here at this precise moment." A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the gasoline can, the remote ignition system. "You started the fire," I said, the horrible truth dawning on me. "You trapped us here deliberately." "The fire is merely a tool," the figure replied. "A circle to focus the ritual and to keep the uninitiated at bay. But yes, we have watched you, guided you, prepared you for this moment." Elena broke away from me, anger overcoming her fear. "Prepared us? For what? To be murdered by a bunch of psychos in Halloween costumes?" The figure's voice took on a dreamy, almost rapturous quality. "To be transformed. To feed the hunger of a god and become part of something greater than yourselves. Your fear, your pain, your very essence will fuel the awakening." As it spoke, the other cultists began to close in, their chanting reaching a fever pitch. The fire roared in response, tendrils of flame reaching towards us like grasping fingers. "No," Mike said, stepping in front of our group protectively. "We're not going to be part of your sick ritual. We're leaving now." The lead figure's mask twisted into a grotesque parody of pity. "Oh, brave one. You still don't understand. You are already part of the ritual. You have been since the moment you set foot in these woods." With a gesture from the leader, two of the cultists grabbed Elena. She screamed, struggling against their grip, but their strength was inhuman. "Let her go," I shouted, lunging forward, but invisible forces held me back. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming as solid as steel. The lead cultist approached Elena, producing a curved dagger from the folds of its robe. The blade seemed to drink in the light, an impossibly dark void against the firelit clearing. "The first sacrifice," it intoned. fear given form to feed the flames. "Please," Elena sobbed, her struggles weakening. "Please don't do this." I fought against the unseen bonds with every ounce of strength I had, but it was useless. We could only watch in horror as the dagger descended. But just before it struck, a sound cut through the chanting, a deep, resonant boom that seemed to shake the very ground. The cultists faltered, their perfect synchronization disrupted. The lead figure turned, its mask betraying a hint of uncertainty for the first time. "Impossible," it hissed. "The binding was perfect, unless—" Taking advantage of the distraction, Mike tackled the cultists holding Elena. In the chaos that followed, we managed to break free, running blindly into the smoke-filled forest. "This way!" Craig shouted, gesturing towards a gap in the fire line that hadn't been there moments before. As we fled, I caught one last glimpse of the clearing. The cultists were in disarray, their chanting now frantic and discordant, and rising above them, visible for just a moment through the smoke, was a shape of impossible vastness, a being of char and ember, stirring to wakefulness. We had escaped the cult, but I feared we had only traded one nightmare for another. Whatever cosmic horror they had sought to awaken was now loose, and we were still trapped in its domain. The real trial, I realized with growing dread, was only just beginning. We ran until our lungs burned, the acrid smoke searing our throats with each desperate breath. The gap in the fire line had closed behind us, but we'd gained no respite. If anything, the inferno seemed to have intensified, the flames reaching impossible heights, their color shifting to an otherworldly blue-white that hurt to look at directly. "Stop!" Craig wheezed, doubling over. "We need to catch our breath." We huddled together in a small clearing, the fire hemming us in on all sides. The air shimmered with heat, making the world beyond our little sanctuary waver and distort. "What was that thing?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see it?" I nodded grimly, the image seared into my mind. "I saw it, but I don't know if I can believe what I saw." Mike paced restlessly, his eyes darting from tree to tree as if expecting the cultists to materialize at any moment. "We need to focus on getting out of here. Whatever that was, whatever those lunatics were trying to do, it's not our problem." But even as he spoke, a low rumble shook the ground beneath our feet. The tremor built in intensity until the trees themselves swayed and groaned. "Oh God," Danny breathed, pointing skyward. We looked up, and I felt my heart stop. The smoke above us was moving, not drifting with the wind, but coalescing, taking shape. As we watched in horrified fascination, it formed into a vast, nightmarish visage, a face of cinders and ash, its eyes twin vortexes of flame. "I don't think we get to decide if it's our problem anymore," I said, my mouth dry with fear. The face in the sky opened its maw, and when it spoke, it was as if the very air was being torn apart. "Awakened," it boomed, the sound reverberating through our bodies. "After eons of slumber, I am awakened." Elena clapped her hands over her ears, tears streaking down her soot-stained face. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But it was real, all too terrifyingly real. As the entity's gaze swept over us, I felt a pressure in my mind, an alien presence sifting through my thoughts and memories like they were open books. "Humans," it rumbled, a note of contempt in its earth-shaking voice. "Always humans, meddling with forces beyond their comprehension." Craig, ever the scientist, seemed to have gone into a kind of shocked trance. He stared up at the impossible being, muttering to himself. A manifestation of collective unconscious fears, psychic projection on a massive scale, or a genuine interdimensional entity. "Who cares what it is?" Mike snapped. "How do we stop it?" The face in the sky twisted into something that might have been a smile, if smiles were made of nightmares. "Stop me? Foolish mortals. I am the primordial flame, the first spark that lit the universe. I have slumbered since before your kind crawled from the muck." Its gaze focused on me, and I felt my mind being probed, memories and emotions laid bare. "You!" it boomed. "You have questions. Ask." Fighting against the terror that threatened to overwhelm me, I forced myself to speak. What do you want?" "Want?" The being seemed almost amused. "I want what all things want, to grow, to consume, to spread." As it spoke, tendrils of fire shot out from the main inferno, igniting trees far beyond the original circle. The fire was expanding, and fast. "The cult," Danny said suddenly. "They were trying to control you, weren't they? To use you for their own purposes." A sound like a mountain splitting in two echoed across the sky. The entity's laughter. "Control me?" They were gnats, thinking themselves giants. Their ritual merely weakened the barriers that held me at bay. "So you're free now?" I asked, a horrible realization dawning. "Free to what? Burn the whole world?" The face in the sky shifted, its features becoming somehow sharper, more defined. "Free? Not yet. But soon. With each thing I burn, with each fear I consume, my power grows. And you," it paused, its gaze sweeping over our group. "You will be the kindling that fuels my rebirth." As it spoke, the fires around us surged forward, closing in with terrifying speed. We huddled closer together, the heat becoming unbearable. "There has to be a way to stop this," Mike said desperately. "Everything has a weakness, right?" But as the flames licked at our heels, as the smoke thickened and the monstrous face loomed ever larger, I began to doubt. We were facing something ancient, something that had existed long before humanity and would likely exist long after. What hope did we have against such a force? And yet as I looked at my friends, at the determination in their eyes, even in the face of this cosmic horror, I felt a spark of something. Not hope, not exactly, but a refusal to give up without a fight. "Listen," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "That thing, whatever it is, it's feeding off our fear. Maybe if we—" But before I could finish, a new sound cut through the roar of the flames. Sirens, distant but growing closer, the face in the sky contorted in what might have been surprise or anger. "Interlopers," it boomed. "The veil weakens but is not yet fully sundered. Our time grows short." The fires pulled back slightly, forming a tight circle around us. Tendrils of flame reached out, caressing our skin with searing heat. "You will be my avatars," the entity declared, "marked by fire, touched by ancient power. Go forth and spread my influence, for I am coming, and the world will burn." As the sirens grew louder, as shouts and the sound of emergency vehicles penetrated the wall of fire, I felt something change within me. A heat, not painful but insistent, spreading through my veins. I looked at my friends and saw the same realization in their eyes. We had survived, yes, but we had been changed. Marked, as the entity had said. And as the firefighters finally broke through, as we were rushed to safety and the nightmare seemed to recede, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The ancient evil had awakened, and whether we wanted to or not, we were now part of its grand, terrifying design. The world around us had become a hellscape of fire and smoke, the air thick with ash and the screams of an awakening cosmic horror. We huddled together, our minds reeling from the enormity of what we faced. But even in the depths of this nightmare, a spark of human resilience flickered to life. "We can't just give up," I said, my voice hoarse from the smoke. "There has to be a way out of this." Mike nodded grimly, his eyes scanning the inferno that surrounded us. "Sam's right. We didn't come this far to become kindling for some ancient fire demon." Elena, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since our encounter with the cult, suddenly spoke up. "The ritual," she said, her eyes widening with realization. "It's not complete." We all turned to look at her, confusion momentarily overriding our fear. "What do you mean?" Craig asked, his scientific curiosity piqued even in the face of imminent doom. Elena's words tumbled out in a rush. The cultist said the circle must be unbroken. But look, she pointed to the far edge of the fire line, where the flames seemed to struggle and flicker. There's a weak spot. The circle isn't perfect. A glimmer of hope sparked in my chest. So if we break the circle completely, we might disrupt whatever cosmic mojo is keeping that thing here, Mike finished, a determined gleam in his eye. Danny, ever the pragmatist, frowned. That's great in theory, but how exactly do we break a circle of fire? In case you haven't noticed, we're a bit short on firefighting equipment. As if in response to her words, the entity's voice boomed across the sky once more. Your struggles are futile, mortals. Embrace your destiny as vessels of my will. The ground shook beneath our feet, and the weak spot in the fire line began to close. Our window of opportunity was shrinking by the second. We have to try, I said, desperation lending strength to my voice. It's our only chance. Craig, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. I have an idea. It's crazy and probably suicidal, but it might work. We gathered close as he outlined his plan, each of us acutely aware of the closing ring of fire and the looming presence above. The cult used modern technology to start this fire, Craig explained, which means there must be a control mechanism somewhere. If we can find it and overload it, we might be able to create a bigger gap in the circle, Mike finished, nodding in understanding. Elena looked skeptical. But how do we find it? This place is huge, and we don't exactly have time for a scavenger hunt. I closed my eyes, trying to think back to what we'd seen in the cultists' clearing. The altar, I said suddenly. There was something under it, a red container. I thought it was just a gas can, but what if... It's the control hub, Craig said, excitement breaking through his fear. Disguised to blend in with their primitive aesthetic. Clever. Danny shook her head. Even if you're right, how do we get there? The fire is everywhere. Mike stood up, a look of grim determination on his face. We make a run for it. Together. The entity, whatever it is, it's not fully here yet. It's still feeding off our fear. If we refuse to give in to that fear, we might be able to push through, I finished, understanding dawning. It was a desperate plan, bordering on insanity. But as the flames crept ever closer, as the face in the sky loomed larger, we knew it was our only hope. Okay, Elena said, her voice shaky but resolute. How do we do this? Craig took a deep breath. We need to overload the system. If I can access the control panel, I might be able to reverse the ignition sequence. But it'll take time, and someone will need to keep the cultists off my back. I'll do it, Mike said without hesitation. I'll buy you as much time as I can. Danny and Elena exchanged a look. We'll create a diversion, Danny said. Draw their attention away from you guys. I nodded, feeling a strange calm settle over me. I'll guide us to the altar. I think I can feel where it is. As I spoke, I realized it was true. There was a pull, a sense of wrongness that seemed to emanate from a specific direction, whether it was some lingering effect of the entity's touch or just heightened intuition born of desperation, I couldn't say. But I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that I could lead us to where we needed to go. This is futile, the entity's voice rumbled, shaking the very air around us. You cannot escape your destiny. But its words, instead of inspiring fear, only strengthened our resolve. Ready? I asked, looking at each of my friends in turn. They nodded, fear evident in their eyes but overshadowed by determination. Then let's go. Together. As one, we stood and faced the wall of fire. I took a deep breath, feeling the heat sear my lungs, and stepped forward. To my amazement, the flames seemed to part just slightly as if recoiling from our collective will. Now, I shouted, and we ran. We sprinted through the inferno, the fire licking at our heels but never quite catching us. I could feel the entity's rage, its confusion at our defiance, but with each step our confidence grew. As we neared the clearing, I saw the cultists gathered around the altar, their chanting reaching a fevered pitch. but they faltered as we burst through the flames, unburned and unbroken. "Go," I yelled to Craig, pointing at the altar. "We'll handle the rest." As Craig dove for the hidden control panel, as Mike engaged the startled cultists, as Danny and Elena created chaos on the opposite side of the clearing, I felt a surge of hope. We had a chance. A small one, born of desperation and fueled by the unbreakable bonds of friendship, but a chance nonetheless. And as I joined the fray, ready to fight for our lives and the fate of the world itself, I knew that whatever the outcome, we would face it together. The steady beep of medical equipment is the first thing I become aware of as consciousness slowly returns. My eyes flutter open, squinting against the harsh fluorescent lights of what I quickly realize is a hospital room. For a moment, just a brief, blissful moment, I wonder if it was all a nightmare. But then the pain hits, a deep, throbbing ache that seems to permeate every cell of my body. And with the pain comes the memories, flooding back in a torrent of terror and fire. A nurse notices I'm awake and hurries over. "Mr. Thompson, can you hear me? You're in the hospital. You're safe now." Safe. The word feels hollow, meaningless, because I know the truth. None of us are safe. Not anymore. "My friends," I croak, my throat raw from smoke and screaming. "Where are my friends?" The nurse's face falls and my heart sinks. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson. You were the only survivor found at the scene. The only survivor." The words echo in my mind, each repetition bringing fresh waves of grief and guilt. Mike, Elena, Danny, Craig, gone. Sacrificed to stop something beyond human comprehension. Days pass in a haze of pain medication and debriefings. Park rangers, fire investigators, even FBI agents. They all want to know what happened in those woods. I tell them what I can, leaving out the parts that I know they'll never believe. A freak wildfire, I say. We got lost. My friends didn't make it out. But at night, when the hospital goes quiet and the shadows grow long, I can't escape the truth. I see their faces in my dreams, hear their screams in every crackling flame, and always, I feel the presence of something vast and terrible, watching, waiting. One night, unable to sleep, I hobble to the window of my room. The city stretches out below, a sea of twinkling lights, so normal, so oblivious to the horror that nearly consumed the world. "You should be resting," a voice says behind me. I turn to see Dr. Reeves, the psychiatrist they assigned to my case. "Can't sleep," I mutter. "Too many nightmares." She nods sympathetically, but I can see the doubt in her eyes. She doesn't believe me. None of them do. "Sam," she says gently, "we've talked about this. What you experienced was traumatic, yes, but there were no cults, no rituals. The fire was a natural phenomenon, tragic but explainable." I want to laugh. Explainable, if only she knew. "Then explain this," I say, rolling up my sleeve to reveal the mark on my forearm. It's not a burn, not really. The skin is unblemished, but there's a pattern there visible only when the light hits it just right. A swirling, flame-like design that seems to move when you're not looking directly at it. Dr. Reeves frowns. "Sam, there's nothing there. We've been over this. Your skin healed remarkably well. There are no lasting burn marks. But I know what I see, what I feel. The entity's final words echo in my mind. You will be my avatars, marked by fire, touched by ancient power." "You don't understand," I say, frustration building. "It's not over, it's just beginning." Dr. Reeves sighs, making a note on her clipboard. "I think we need to adjust your medication. These delusions—" "They're not delusions," I snap, then immediately regret it as I see her tense. I force myself to calm down. "I'm sorry, I need you to believe me. Something is coming. Something terrible." She puts a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Sam, you've been through a lot. It's natural to try to find meaning in tragedy, to create narratives that help us cope. But sometimes, horrible things just happen. There's no grand conspiracy. No ancient evil. Just a terrible accident that you survived. I want to argue, to make her understand. But I can see it's useless. How can I explain the unexplainable? How can I make her comprehend the cosmic horror that nearly consumed us all? As Dr. Reeves leaves, promising to return in the morning, I turn back to the window. The city sleeps on, unaware. But as I watch, I see something that makes my blood run cold. In the distance, a plume of smoke rises against the night sky. And for just a moment, I swear I see a face in the writhing clouds. A terrible, familiar grin. It's starting, I whisper to the empty room. God help us all. In the days and weeks that follow, I'm released from the hospital. I try to rebuild my life, to forget. But I can't. The news is full of reports. Unexplained fires breaking out across the country, around the world. Cult activity on the rise. And always, that nagging sense of something vast and terrible stirring just beyond the veil of reality. I write this now as a warning, a testament, to honor my friends who sacrificed everything, to prepare those who might yet stand against the coming darkness. Because I know the truth now. The fire spirit is awake and it hungers, and we, marked by its touch, are the heralds of its arrival. I fear this is only the beginning. The embers of an ancient evil have been stoked, and soon the world will burn. All we can do now is prepare, resist, and hope that when the time comes, humanity will find the strength to face the inferno. But in my darkest moments, when I feel the mark on my arm pulse with eldritch heat, I wonder, will it be enough? Or are we all just kindling, waiting for the spark that will set the world ablaze? Only time will tell. And time, I fear, is running out.